There are stories that begin with chaos. And then there are stories like this one. Stories that begin with something so routine, so ordinary, so painfully familiar that no one involved realizes they are standing at the edge of a tragedy that will later shake an entire community. The death of Nathaniel Pickett in 2018 is one of those stories. It's a case that seemed simple at first glance. A nighttime encounter, a brief confrontation, a single officer's account, and a man whose life ended in seconds. Except, nothing about this case was simple. Nothing stayed still. The deeper investigators looked, the more the story bent and twisted, until even the most confident officials couldn't explain away the inconsistencies. In fact, the case would eventually become a symbol, a quiet warning whispered across communities. If something this ordinary could end in a tragedy this complicated, what else are we missing? A man who wasn't perfect. A man who was trying to stay stable, trying to keep moving forward, trying to live with dignity in a world that didn't always make it easy. Nathaniel Pickett. I am 30 years old. Tall, athletic, quiet but warm when he trusted someone. A man who got into trouble sometimes, yes, but also a man who helped his neighbors move furniture without being asked. A man who joked with his nieces. A man who loved music, especially anything with a heavy bass line. A man who knew struggle up close and still believed he could turn things around. He was someone you could pass on the street and never guess the storms happening behind the scenes. But that's the thing about life. They rarely match the labels placed on them after they end. It was November 19, 2015. Although the civil proceedings would stretch into 2018, turning that year into the case's defining moment, the story itself begins here. In San Bernardino County, California. Quiet night. Cold wind rolling across the desert flats. Streetlights flickering on a stretch of road where trouble rarely came, but tension lived permanently under the surface. At around 9 p.m., Nathaniel walked out of a small motel where he had been staying. His hands were empty. His phone was in his pocket. He wasn't running. He wasn't acting erratically. He was simply walking. A moment so ordinary it could have belonged to anyone. Except that this one decision, stepping outside into the night, placed him on a collision course with a sheriff's deputy whose actions that evening would later become the center of national attention. Deputy Kyle Woods, a name that would echo through courtrooms, depositions, community meetings, and long, restless nights for the Pickett family. Woods was on patrol when he noticed Nathaniel. According to Woods, Nathaniel looked suspicious, though he later struggled to clearly define what that meant. Some accounts say Nathaniel was jaywalking. Others say he was walking through the motel parking lot. Still others suggest Woods recognized him from a prior encounter. What's strange is that even in official reports, Woods' reason for making contact with Nathaniel seemed to shift slightly each time. A small inconsistency on paper, a massive red flag in hindsight, but that night none of that mattered yet. The only thing that mattered was that Woods got out of his patrol vehicle, and Nathaniel kept walking. Most people imagine confrontations like this start with shouting or sirens. But according to witnesses, this one began quietly, with a simple command, "Hey, come here." Nathaniel didn't. Not because he was resisting, not because he was fleeing. Witnesses described him as walking normally, almost casually. Maybe he didn't hear. Maybe he didn't understand the command. Maybe he didn't believe it was directed at him. But whatever the reason, Nathaniel continued moving, not running, not looking over his shoulder, just walking. Seconds later, everything escalated. Woods closed the distance quickly. Nathaniel stepped backward, raising his hands. Not in aggression, but in confusion. Witnesses saw a struggle. But the nature of that struggle? That would become the heart of the entire mystery. The officer claimed Nathaniel punched him. A bold, unequivocal statement. But there was no bruising, no redness, no swelling, and, most strangely, no torn skin on Nathaniel's knuckles, something almost always visible after a forceful strike. A small detail, yes, but in true crime, small details speak the loudest. The physical struggle lasted seconds, not minutes, not long enough for a dramatic fight, just seconds, and then the moment that would haunt the Pickett family forever. A single gunshot. Nathaniel fell, face down, still, silent. Backup arrived quickly. Paramedics tried to revive him, but it was over before they started. Nathaniel Pickett was gone. But here is where the unusual nature of this case begins to reveal itself. When law enforcement uses deadly force, the narrative is usually immediate and consistent. A justification rooted in the officer's safety. A sequence of events that aligns with the physical evidence. But in this case, the story kept shifting. Wood's initial explanation didn't perfectly match his later statements. Witnesses described movements the officer never mentioned. And physical evidence contradicted elements of both stories. This wasn't one inconsistency. It was a chain of them. Why was Nathaniel stopped? Why were eyewitness accounts so different from the officers? Why was physical evidence inconsistent with the claim of a punch? Why did the timeline feel impossibly fast in some reports? And the most haunting question, how could a routine encounter end this way? So quickly, the Pickett family refused to accept silence. They asked questions, filed complaints, spoke to reporters, and eventually pursued a civil lawsuit. In 2018, the trial brought everything into sharp focus. Lawyers dissected Wood's account line by line. Experts analyzed body mechanics, movement, and forensic timing. Witnesses stood before a courtroom and repeated exactly what they saw. The inconsistencies didn't fade. They grew louder. And then came the twist. One almost no one expected. A twist not about the confrontation itself, but about what may have happened long before it. But that comes later. For now, we return to the night itself. A man walking outside a motel. An officer making a split-second decision. A community unaware that a tragedy had just unfolded before them. When Nathaniel's mother received the news, she didn't scream. She didn't faint. She didn't collapse. She sat hard, as if the world had suddenly tilted beneath her. Something deep inside her, mother's intuition, knew instantly that the explanation given wasn't enough. Her son was gone, but the story she was told felt incomplete, thin, detached from truth, and grief has a strange effect on people. It sharpens the senses. It amplifies intuition. And in Nathaniel's mother, it ignited a fire that would push this case into the light. Because if the story didn't add up, maybe the truth was still buried, and she intended to uncover it, no matter how long it took. Nathaniel Pickett's death didn't make national headlines overnight. In fact, for weeks it barely made local ones. A short article, a brief news segment, a couple of mentions on social media. To many, it was another tragic encounter in a country already overwhelmed by similar ones. But to the people who knew him, to his mother, his family, his neighbors, nothing about the story felt right. And it wasn't long before cracks in the official narrative began to appear. Not small cracks, deep fractures that suggested something much bigger was off. The inconsistencies started with the very reason Nathaniel was stopped. According to one report, Nathaniel was jaywalking. But according to another, he was loitering. And according to yet another, Woods believed he recognized him from a prior encounter. 3 explanations and 3 meanings. 3 conflicting justifications for a single moment. Law enforcement encounters are expected to have clarity. This one didn't, but this was only the beginning. The court documents revealed that Wood's story evolved multiple times. In the first version, Nathaniel charged at the officer. In the second, Nathaniel threw a punch. In the third, he lunged aggressively. Each variation shared the same theme but differed in the details, a red flag in any criminal inquiry. Then came the physical evidence. If Nathaniel had punched the officer hard enough to justify deadly force, Woods should have shown visible signs of impact. Swelling, bruising, tenderness, even mild redness. But medical records showed none of it. And Nathaniel's hands? Not a single mark. Defense experts argued that injuries don't always appear immediately. They argued lighting conditions and adrenaline could mask bruising. But civil attorneys countered with a simple truth. The timeline didn't support that theory. This encounter didn't unfold over minutes. It unfolded over seconds. Then came the witness accounts. 2 witnesses, standing outside the motel, described Nathaniel as defensive, not aggressive. Hands raised, stepping backward, confused, not combative, not threatening, not making deliberate strikes. It was a description painfully at odds with Wood's narrative. But the most significant inconsistency was yet to come, one buried inside the officer's own training records. A detail that would transform this story from a tragic misunderstanding into something far more complicated. As the Pickett family pushed for answers, more inconsistencies emerged. Some subtle, others impossible to ignore. And slowly, what began as a simple officer-involved shooting started to unravel into something far more troubling. The next set of questions came from Nathaniel's body positioning at the moment he was shot. Wood stated that Nathaniel was lunging aggressively toward him. He described a forward motion and attack. But photos and expert analysis suggested a very different scenario. Nathaniel fell face down, angled slightly away from the officer. Experts explained that someone who is moving forward during a gunshot impact would likely fall differently, either collapsing forward with momentum or slumping at an angle consistent with the motion. But the positioning of Nathaniel's body hinted at something else. He may not have been lunging at all. He may have been turning, stepping back, or attempting to disengage. Tiny detail, but a detail that opened the door to a much larger question. Was the officer's account physically possible? All in a matter of 3 to 5 seconds. To an untrained ear, that might sound feasible. But experts in officer training, confrontation dynamics, and human reaction times argued otherwise. One expert explained in court, "The sequence described requires more time than the timeline allows. It is physically improbable for that many actions to occur in that short of a period unless parts of the event are being misremembered or misrepresented." This wasn't speculation. It was math. Human reaction time, weapon draw time, and physical positioning all follow predictable patterns. The officer's description didn't align with those patterns. Something didn't fit. Then came the revelation that changed everything. During the civil lawsuit depositions, attorneys uncovered details about Wood's training history. Specifically, issues in prior training related to use of force procedures and report accuracy. This wasn't the explosive revelation the media loves. There were no dramatic misconduct accusations tied to earlier incidents, but there were documented concerns about memory recall under stress, report drafting consistency, and decision-making in rapidly evolving encounters. Small notes. Small warnings, but warnings nonetheless. And yet, despite those concerns, Woods had passed the required evaluations and was cleared for duty. The Pickett family's attorneys argued that these training gaps may have contributed to inconsistent recollections or decision-making errors. The defense argued that the officer acted reasonably given the circumstances. But the inconsistencies only grew from here. One of the most haunting parts of this case rests in the statements of two witnesses who were feet away from the encounter. Their stories aligned with each other, but not with the officers. Witness number 1 described the encounter as quick and confusing, but she emphasized he wasn't attacking. He had his hands up like he didn't know what was happening. Witness number 2 recalled, "The officer grabbed him first, then they struggled, but I didn't see Nathaniel hit him." Neither witness observed a punch, the punch the officer cited as a key justification for firing. This raised another question. If Nathaniel had indeed delivered a powerful punch, why didn't a single witness see it? In a close-quarter struggle, in a well-lit motel parking lot, how could such a critical moment go unseen? Then came the forensic detail that deepened the uncertainty. Experts analyzing the scene noted that the officer's uniform displayed no fibers, no skin cells, and no consistent impact pattern that would normally accompany a punch delivered with force to the face or body. This didn't conclusively prove the absence of a punch, but it certainly didn't support it. The motel's security camera did not capture the shooting itself, but it captured enough to raise eyebrows. In the seconds before the fatal moment, Nathaniel appeared calm. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't acting erratically. Then the officer's vehicle entered the frame. Nathaniel looked briefly in its direction, then continued walking, not running, not darting away. The moment looked ordinary, almost forgettable. But what the footage revealed next became another point of contention. The officer exited his vehicle quickly, almost too quickly, according to experts. This suggested something that civil attorneys would argue repeatedly in court. The officer may have approached with an assumption of threat rather than an assessment of behavior. Approaching with fear or preconceptions can dramatically alter decision-making. It affects perception, reaction time, and ultimately the interpretation of events. The camera didn't show the confrontation, but it showed enough to reveal that the escalation may have begun before words were exchanged. During the civil proceedings, a troubling rumor surfaced among community members. Was there a missing video? Records showed the officer's body camera was not activated during the encounter. The department explained that the camera was not functioning properly or not turned on in time, but questions persisted. Was there dashcam footage? Was there additional motel video not released? And were there recordings from nearby businesses? Ultimately, no additional footage surfaced, but the absence itself added fuel to the fire. In high-stakes cases, missing video doesn't just leave gaps. It creates suspicion. Whether fair or not, the lack of visual evidence made the inconsistencies louder. Multiple deputies responded to the scene after the shooting. Some described Woods as shaken. Others described him as calm but breathing heavily. Officers often experience adrenaline spikes after critical incidents, so this alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was this. Woods repeatedly stated that he feared for his life during the confrontation, yet none of the responding deputies observed visible injuries that aligned with being attacked moments earlier. The civil attorneys highlighted this detail repeatedly. Fear can be real even when danger is not, but decisions made in fear must still be accountable to fact. This argument became central to the case. As the Pickett family gathered evidence and legal support, the inconsistencies formed a pattern, one that pointed to the possibility that the shooting may not have been justified. Their attorney emphasized that the case wasn't about demonizing law enforcement. It was about accountability, understanding what really happened, ensuring the truth wasn't overshadowed by procedure or assumptions. And the more they dug, the more they found something that rarely surfaces clearly in cases like this. It wasn't just one flaw. It wasn't a single misinterpretation. It was a chain reaction of inconsistencies. So long, so detailed, so persistent, that it forced everyone involved to re-examine the entire narrative. And then came the turning point, the moment that shifted the story from a tragedy into a legal battle with national implications. A discovery buried in the officer's testimony that, once revealed, would alter the direction of the case permanently. For months, the Pickett family's legal team pored over every scrap of documentation surrounding Nathaniel's death. They traced timelines, compared testimonies, and consulted experts whose careers revolved around reconstructing the truth behind chaotic moments. Yet nothing, not the inconsistencies, not the conflicting statements, prepared them for what would unfold during a crucial deposition. It happened quietly, without fanfare or raised voices. There was no dramatic confession or shocking outburst. Just a single question, asked calmly across a wooden table, followed by an answer that didn't match anything the officer had said before. The attorney leaned forward, eyes steady on Deputy Woods. "Can you describe the precise moment you believed your life was in danger?" Woods paused. The room felt still, as though the air itself was waiting. He began speaking slowly, describing how Nathaniel moved quickly and reached toward him. His words drifted into vague territory, less certain, less sharp, less aligned with earlier statements. Instead of describing a punch, he spoke of contact, or maybe a push. It seemed like a small shift, but to anyone who had studied the case closely, it was enormous. His phrasing didn't match the initial report. It didn't match his statements to investigators. It didn't match his courtroom testimony. It was a new version, subtle but undeniably different. The attorney repeated the officer's words back to him. "He reached toward you? Not punched you? That's not what you said before." "Correct." Wood's eyes flickered. His jaw tensed. He hesitated before answering. "Things happened fast. It's hard to remember exactly. It wasn't an admission of wrongdoing. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, but it was a crack, one that would quickly widen. In cases like this, the physical details matter. The timing, the movement, the angles. And so the Pickett family's attorneys brought in a biomechanics expert, Dr. Raymond Keller, whose testimony would reshape the narrative. Using mannequins, diagrams, and slow-motion reconstructions, Keller recreated the sequence described by Woods. The alleged punch, the officer fell, the weapon being drawn, the fatal shot. He measured the time each action should take and compared it to the timeline provided by witnesses and by Woods himself. And then, with a calm voice that carried more weight than any accusation, he explained, "The sequence described by the officer is physically inconsistent with the evidence. It could not have happened in the time frame given. This wasn't a theory. It wasn't speculation. It was math. Human reaction time, weapon draw speed, body movement, all predictable, measurable." And according to Keller, the officer's version simply didn't fit the laws of physics. The defense tried to push back, but Keller was unshakable. The described motion is not supported by body positioning, by injury patterns, or by the time available. The event, as stated, is improbable. The room listened in stunned silence. The jury took notes. The Pickett family sat motionless. But inside, they felt something shift. Another layer of the case emerged through psychological experts, specialists in human behavior during high-stress encounters. They explained that officers often experience tunnel vision, auditory exclusion, time distortion, and memory gaps when they perceive danger. This, they argued, could explain inconsistencies in Wood's recollection. But the plaintiff's attorneys pushed back with a powerful point. Fear may distort memory, but it cannot justify inaccuracies in the foundational facts. And it cannot excuse the use of lethal force against an unarmed, non-aggressive man. A distorted memory is not an excuse. An unjustified shooting cannot be reframed as an honest mistake. One strange detail stood out in the officer's earliest report, something he never repeated afterward. He wrote that Nathaniel reached for his waistband. That kind of gesture changes everything in an officer's mind. It often becomes the very justification for firing a weapon. But in later statements, the detail vanished completely, as though it had never existed. Attorneys confronted Woods. "Why did you initially say he reached for his waistband, but later omit it?" His answer was quiet, uncertain, almost detached. "I may have misremembered that part. It was perhaps the most damaging moment yet. If the waistband gesture never happened, then a critical justification evaporated. If the officer misremembered something so huge, what else was wrong?" Toward the end of the testimony phase, a woman who had stayed at the motel the night of the shooting stepped forward. She had remained quiet for months, unsure whether her perspective mattered. But when she spoke, the entire courtroom leaned forward. "I saw him step back," she said softly. "Not forward, back." Her words contradicted every version the officer had given. Every justification for perceiving Nathaniel as a threat now hung by a thread. She continued, "I didn't see him hit the officer. I just saw him raise his arms, like he didn't know what was happening." Her testimony aligned with the forensic evidence, the biomechanics analysis, the body positioning, and other eyewitness descriptions. Nathaniel hadn't been attacking. He had been overwhelmed, confused, retreating. The tragedy wasn't merely the shooting. It was the misunderstanding that escalated it. As the civil trial entered its final stretch, the weight of the inconsistencies, contradictions, and forensic revelations hung heavily over the courtroom. The Pickett family sat quietly in the front row, their faces steady but tense. They had listened to every testimony, every explanation, every attempt to justify or rationalize what had happened to Nathaniel. But now, in this final phase, the most powerful evidence of all was about to be revealed, and ironically, it had been sitting in the file the entire time. The forensic team began by focusing on something deceptively simple: distance. Not emotion, not perception, not fear, just distance measured in inches and feet. The officer's account described a close-quarters struggle, a punch, and a lunge that forced him to fire in self-defense. But when analysts measured the trajectory of the bullet, the location of shell casings, and the positions of footprints in the dirt, they discovered something startling. Nathaniel hadn't been inches away. He hadn't been reaching. He hadn't been lunging. He had been several feet back, far enough that the officer's version didn't make physical sense. The moment diagrams appeared on the courtroom screen, you could see the shift in the jury. The measurements weren't subjective, they were cold, precise, scientific. They showed that Nathaniel was retreating, not advancing. The officer's gunshot didn't align with a forward attack. It aligned with a backward step. A quiet wave moved through the courtroom. Several jurors leaned in. This wasn't just a discrepancy. This was the foundation of the defense cracking open. Then the forensic analyst delivered the line that would become the heart of the case. Based on the evidence, Nathaniel Pickett was moving backward when he was shot. For a moment, the courtroom sat frozen. The officer's narrative of a life-threatening attack now stood in direct conflict with the physical evidence. But the revelations weren't finished. Not yet. Next came the video analysis of Nathaniel's movements just before the confrontation. A small clip from the motel security camera showed Nathaniel lifting the side of his pants as he walked. It was a simple, unconscious motion, one anyone might make, especially if wearing clothes that didn't fit well. The forensic team tied that moment to witness testimony describing Nathaniel raising his hands shortly before the shot. They analyzed the angle of his elbow, the height of his wrist, the direction of his shoulders. And then they connected the dots in a way that made the entire courtroom inhale sharply. Nathaniel had not been reaching toward an officer. He had not been striking. He had not been preparing to grab it. He had been adjusting his clothing, pulling up his loose pants. A normal movement, a human movement, a movement misinterpreted in a split second of tension. And yet that ordinary gesture had triggered the deadliest possible response. The irony deepened when the plaintiffs revealed a detail that felt almost too tragic to be real. Nathaniel's pants were 2 sizes too big, donated clothing he was wearing while trying to restart his life. His family had been supporting him as he worked on rebuilding stability. That night, the clothes meant to help him had instead contributed to the misunderstanding that cost him everything. When this detail was presented, the courtroom fell absolutely silent. Even the defense attorneys paused, their expressions tightening. There are cases where both sides continue fighting despite overwhelming evidence. But there are moments in a courtroom, rare, heavy moments, when the truth becomes undeniable. This was one of them. The plaintiff's attorney stepped forward and addressed the jury with a voice that resonated through the room. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't attacking. He was adjusting his clothes. Every piece of evidence that followed, trajectory calculations, body positioning diagrams, witness testimony, reinforced the same conclusion. Nathaniel had been misunderstood, and that misunderstanding had turned fatal. The final day of the civil trial arrived with a strange stillness, the kind of hush that settles over a room when everyone inside knows something irreversible is about to happen. The courtroom benches were filled. Family members, reporters, curious members of the public, and attorneys on both sides preparing for closing arguments that would shape the legacy of the entire case. Nathaniel Pickett's mother sat quietly, her hands folded, eyes fixed forward. She had spent years living in the shadow of unanswered questions. Now, she was only hours away from hearing the judgment that would determine whether those questions had finally meant something, whether her son's story had been told fully, honestly, and without distortion. The defense attorneys delivered their closing first. Their argument focused on the difficulty of policing, the unpredictability of encounters, and the stressful nature of split-second decisions. They spoke of fear, of uncertainty, of how quickly a situation can escalate. They reminded the jury that the officer was human, and that humans make mistakes. It was a compelling argument, one designed to evoke empathy for the officer. But something was missing. No matter how heartfelt their words were, they couldn't erase the scientific measurements, the forensic contradictions, or the eyewitness accounts that consistently disproved the idea that Nathaniel had attacked. Then came the plaintiff's turn. Their lead attorney stepped forward, speaking with a voice that was steady, firm, and layered with the weight of a family's grief. He didn't shout. He didn't dramatize. He didn't demonize. Instead, he told the jury the story of what actually happened, supported by every piece of evidence they had spent weeks analyzing. He walked them through the timeline. He showed the diagrams again. He replayed the expert testimony in their minds. And then he spoke the sentence that brought tears to Nathaniel's mother's eyes. This case is not about destroying an officer's life. It is about acknowledging the truth of how Nathaniel lost his. He paused. The room held its breath. He stepped back. He raised his hands. He adjusted his clothing. And for that, he died. The attorney didn't need theatrics. The truth was powerful enough. When he finished, the judge gave the jury their instructions. They filed out silently, knowing the decision they were about to make would echo far beyond the walls of that courtroom. Hours passed, then more hours. The Pickett family waited, the tension growing with every tick of the clock. Finally, just after sunset, the bailiff stepped into the hallway. The jury has reached a verdict. Inside the courtroom, every person stood as the jury filed in. Some jurors avoided eye contact. Others looked resolute. All of them seemed changed, affected by the gravity of the evidence they had encountered. The judge asked the foreperson to rise. In the matter of Pickett versus San Bernardino County, a pause, a silence so sharp it felt like the room had stopped breathing. We find in favor of the plaintiff. A ripple went through the courtroom. Shock, relief, release. Nathaniel's mother covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. His siblings held each other tightly. Even some court staff appeared moved. The verdict continued. The county was ordered to pay the Pickett family over $15 million in damages, one of the largest civil rights wrongful death awards in the region's history. But for the family, it wasn't about money. It was about validation. It was about truth. It was about finally hearing the world say what they had known all along. Nathaniel Pickett did not deserve to die. This was justice, not complete justice because no verdict could bring him back, but justice in the sense that the truth had finally been spoken aloud, recorded, recognized, honored. Yet the impact of the case didn't end with the verdict. Far from it. News of the trial spread. Civil rights advocates began referencing the case in discussions about police accountability. Training programs in multiple states cited aspects of the forensic analysis as examples of how misinterpretations can lead to fatal outcomes. And across the country, communities who had never heard of Nathaniel before began saying his name. His story was painful, tragic, unnecessary, but it changed things. It lit conversations, created awareness. It forced systems to confront the consequences of misunderstanding, fear, and split-second judgment. And for a family who had once sat in silence with nothing but grief, this new chapter of acknowledgement meant everything. Nathaniel's mother later said, "He didn't die for nothing. People know the truth now, and that truth will protect someone else's child one day." As the courtroom emptied and the lights dimmed, the family stepped out into the cool night air, carrying with them not just sorrow, but the justice they had fought for. Justice at last had been served. Justice in any form rarely feels complete. It doesn't erase pain. It doesn't resurrect what was lost. It doesn't stitch a broken world back into something whole. But justice does something else, something quieter, something powerful. It recognizes the truth. It acknowledges harm. It validates the grief of those left behind. In the days following the verdict, the courthouse steps became a place of reflection. Reporters gathered, cameras rolling, microphones outstretched, hoping to capture the first reaction from Nathaniel's family. But the family did not rush forward with anger or boastfulness. They stood together, holding each other, speaking gently to the press about who Nathaniel was. Not in the way court records described him, not in the way police reports tried to summarize him, but in the way only a family could. "He was trying," his mother said, her voice steady but soft. "He was working on himself. People forget that everyone is fighting battles you can't see. He deserved a chance to keep fighting." Her words hit deeper than any legal argument. They reminded the country that behind every case, behind every statistic or headline, there is a person, one whose life was complex, flawed, hopeful, human. And as the cameras rolled, something shifted. This was no longer just a verdict. This was a statement that the truth, when fought for with enough determination, can break through even the strongest walls of uncertainty. Cases like Nathaniel's don't fade quietly. They linger, they circulate, they raise uncomfortable questions about training, perception, and the thin line between safety and tragedy in law enforcement encounters. In the months after the verdict, departments across the region began reviewing their training protocols. Some introduced mandatory coursework on implicit bias. Others incorporated scenario-based instruction emphasizing de-escalation, distance, and better assessment of body movements in tense encounters. A few even referenced aspects of the Pickett case directly when discussing reaction times, officer memory distortion, and the consequences of misinterpreting ordinary gestures. Nathaniel's name appeared in academic papers, in policing conferences, in community forums. His story became a case study, not in chaos or criminality, but in misinterpretation, in how fear could eclipse clarity, in how a routine encounter could spiral because two human beings, caught in a moment neither expected, misunderstood each other. For civil rights advocates, the case provided renewed momentum. It provided evidence, measured, forensic, undeniable, that assumptions in police encounters can carry fatal consequences, and that those consequences demand accountability. But beyond all institutional response, there was something more emotional happening, something deeply human. People began sharing Nathaniel's story on social media, not the courtroom diagrams, not the legal summaries, but the story of who he was. Pictures of him smiling with his nieces, anecdotes from neighbors about how he helped carry groceries, memories from childhood friends who remembered him as funny, quiet, and protective. They humanized him. They reclaimed him. They took a story that might have faded into another statistic and turned it into a legacy. Yet even with justice, even with change, the Pickett family faced a truth they could never escape. Nathaniel was gone. Nothing, no amount of money, no headlines, no reforms, could restore the life they once knew. In quiet moments, Nathaniel's mother still replayed the night she received the phone call. She still pictured him stepping out of the motel room, unaware that he was walking into his final moments. She still imagined the path his life might have taken if only things had gone differently. Grief does not disappear. It reshapes itself. It settles into the spaces where memories live. Sometimes that grief is sharp. Sometimes it is soft. But it never fades completely. Yet there was also something else, something unexpected, something the family only came to understand in the months after the trial. Nathaniel's case had given other people courage. Families who had remained silent about their own losses began speaking out. People who had experienced similar encounters stepped forward. Community leaders used the case as fuel for conversations that had long been avoided. In this sense, Nathaniel's story didn't end with him. It continued. In every discussion sparked, in every reform considered, in every person who learned from what happened. His life, though cut short, became part of something bigger. A year after the verdict, Nathaniel's family held a quiet memorial in his honor. No cameras, no reporters, just loved ones gathering to remember the man he was. Not the case, not the controversy, not the tragedy, but the man. They met at a small park near the neighborhood where Nathaniel grew up. Children played on swings nearby. Birds moved through the trees. The world carried on, as it always does, with memories tucked into its corners. Each family member shared a memory. Funny, heartbreaking, warm, or bittersweet. They told stories of Nathaniel as a boy, running barefoot on hot pavement. Stories of him as a teenager, blasting music too loud. Stories of him as an adult, trying to rebuild his life with a quiet determination only those close to him ever saw. And then, in a moment that felt like the closing of a long, painful chapter, his mother spoke again. Her voice didn't tremble. It carried strength that had been forged through sorrow and perseverance. "He mattered," she said simply. "And now the world knows he mattered." Those words settled over everyone present, filling the air with something that felt like peace. Not the kind that erases wounds, but the kind that acknowledges them and moves forward. Some cases begin with chaos. Others begin with an ordinary moment, a man stepping outside, a movement misinterpreted, a misunderstanding that spirals into tragedy. The death of Nathaniel Pickett is not just a story about a confrontation. It is a story about what happens when fear overrides clarity, when perceptions fail, when the smallest mistake carries the greatest cost. It is a reminder that every life has weight and every moment has consequences. But it is also a story about persistence, about a family who refused to let silence bury the truth, about a community that demanded answers, about a courtroom that finally, undeniably recognized what happened. Justice may not heal pain, but it speaks. And sometimes, speaking the truth is the only way forward. In the end, Nathaniel's story is more than a tragedy. It is a warning, a lesson, a legacy, and that legacy lives on today, in the questions we ask, in the accountability we demand, and in the lives saved when training and awareness prevent another misunderstanding from turning fatal. Because stories like this must be told, not to reopen wounds, but to ensure they are never repeated. This is the story of Nathaniel Pickett, a story of truth emerging from contradiction, a story of justice reclaimed, a story of a family who refused to give up. And as always, this has been Into the Deep True Crime, where the truth belongs in the light. And as we close the chapter on this story, let it stay with you, not just as a case, not just as a verdict, but as a reminder of why we tell these stories in the first place. Because every truth brought into the light becomes part of a larger fight for accountability, for fairness, for lives that deserve to be remembered. If Nathaniel's story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you question the versions of events we're so often handed, then I want to invite you to stay with us. Here, we don't just repeat headlines. We look deeper, we question harder, we follow the truth wherever it leads. If you're new to the channel, or if you've been watching quietly from the sidelines, take a moment now, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story we bring into the light. Your support helps us tell these stories the way they deserve to be told, with honesty, clarity, and respect for the people behind the headlines. And if you've been here before, welcome back. You're part of a community that refuses to look away. So stay curious, stay thoughtful, and stay with us, because the next story, the next mystery, the next truth waiting to be uncovered is closer than you think, and you won't want to miss it. This is True Crime Odyssey, True Crime, and we'll see you in the next one.